Welcome to tonight's meeting. We have a two-part meeting. We're going to have some comments and questions from our Lieutenant Governor, and then after that, Putney Democrats are going to meet and fulfill their legal obligation to reorganize as the first step in preparation for the next election cycle. And some people have said, isn't this a little early? Well, in Vermont, maybe it is. But these are extraordinary times. Not just because of the weather, but after the election of 2016, a lot of us woke up to a different world that we could have never believed would have happened. And I'm not just talking about the presidential election. What I'm talking about is about 40 years ago, after what we call the Watergate election, when Republicans lost just about everything in the country, a group of them started meeting and put together a plan. They put together a plan to take over the country. And their plan was to train candidates, send them to their messaging school, send them to their advertising school, to create think tanks, to create media outlets. And from the ground up, school boards, town boards, state legislatures, their plan was to take over the country. And they've been doing a pretty good job. Apart from the presidential election, Republicans now control 66 of the 99 state legislative bodies. And there's 99, I think, because Nebraska only has one legislative body. So I don't think it's too early for us to start pushing back, to organize, to recognize that here in Vermont, if we want to hold on to that vision of Vermont that we've come to believe is how we want to live, then it's time for us to organize from the bottom up and to keep going. To have that vision of Vermont that walks under the banner of justice, whether it's economic justice, social and racial justice, or environmental justice. That we have a sense of what's right and how to move forward. And following Senator Sanders' lead, Vermont needs to lead from the ground up. So that's why we're here today. The other reason we're here is because David Zuckerman doesn't have enough to do right now. He's a farmer, and it's harvest time. So I want to really acknowledge how much we appreciate him helping take the time to come help broaden that vision of Vermont that we all share. Whether it's health care for all, whether it's making sure our environment is protected so what happened in Bennington doesn't happen again. And when it does, government steps up because it's government's place. I believe government is the place that levels the playing field, that helps us and helps everybody. And I think David and I share that piece, that government has a part to play. Government's not the problem, the way the conservatives will tell you. Government is what levels the playing field. So I appreciate all of you coming out on this beautiful summer night. And we're going to hear from the Lieutenant Governor. And then we'll take some questions?
Yeah.
Great. Well, please help me. Oh, one more thing. Laura Chapman here is passing around a mailing list. We would ask if you please sign up. The only thing we're asking for what on the list?
Email and zip code.
All right. Great. If you could help us with that little piece of housekeeping. So without further ado, please welcome Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman.
If he keeps speaking like that, he'll be also running for governor someday. Thank you, Mike, and Jeanette White in the back. Senator White is here. Thank you for inviting me as well. And I just want to mention David Dean, who I think is Mike's district mate, who is someone who was a mentor to me when I first got elected to the House back in 1996. I got sworn in 97, and David was serving then and has done an amazing job for the folks down here, for our water, the waters of the state in particular, and fighting really a challenging battle of the issue of our water quality. And, I can use the phrase water is life, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with as we stood together with our brothers and sisters out at Standing Rock. And also the culture and history of Vermont and farming, and as farming has changed, how that has impacted our water and water quality, and sort of a very challenging both political quality of life and cultural range of discussion, frankly, that I think we all care a lot about all of those things and trying to find a way to have economic justice for our farmers so that they're not pushing the land to the limits where then that also impacts all of us and our water quality in another way, differently than what's happening in Bennington, but with serious consequences as we look at Lake Carmi in the news a lot lately, and I've certainly been getting some calls about that. Not quite at the same moment, but it was about 46 years ago that I was born. So someone's been planning something for me to get somewhere, I guess. But I hadn't really planned on being lieutenant governor. I still pinch myself on occasion and chuckle with some of my friends who have been involved for the last 5 or 10 years going, who would have thought that, I'd be lieutenant governor and you'd be a senator and you'd be a representative or speaker and you'd be president pro tem. I was just talking with a couple folks before that I actually farmed with Mitzi Johnson back in 1994 and lived with her on a small farm up in South Hero. And a few years later, living in Burlington, I rented a room to a guy named Tim Ash, who's now the president pro tem. So I've lived with actually both the speaker and the pro tem, which is kind of comical in a way and strange, and also just the smallness of Vermont and how everybody's connected somehow in some way. And that's a great value to me, is these connections and connections to people like David Dean, who has served you all so well for so long, and Mike and Jeanette doing such a great job for you. It's an honor to come down here. I've been coming down to the southeast part of the state actually for many of those 20 years. Some of you may have been involved with the GMO discussions from many years ago, and we fought for years and years and over a decade and nearly 2 decades for regulation around GMOs. We had introduced and passed seed registration legislation that no other state did, and we were able to track the use of GMOs in Vermont. No other state did that, and the conversation continued to the point where we obviously passed the first in the country labeling law. And all of these things have happened not because I came to the southeast corner of the state or over to Middlebury to meet with folks who are interested, and up to the Northeast Kingdom because folks were interested, but because folks were interested, and because folks were involved, and because folks in Vermont recognize that politics is more than just an activity of voting every couple of years, every 2 years, or every 4 years for president. Politics, and in particular democracy, is an ongoing activity. I've been really having a great time speaking to groups all over the state about how it isn't just voting. Voting is actually sort of the simple and easy part of democracy. A friend of mine said, democracy is not about voting, it's about deliberation. And I would say it's about participation. And it's about continuing to participate through communications with Mike and Jeanette and me and David and everybody else with respect to ideas, with respect to the positions that you hold and that you value as discussions are happening. And that if those of us who hold these values dear, which I think there's probably a lot of common values in this room, speak out on a regular basis, make those phone calls, often in districts maybe where you don't have someone who might have the same values, where here you've got some folks who really do, but even occasionally to those that do, to give them the support in the effort and the fights that they're having around issues, or fights are really not the right word, the deliberations around the issues in Montpelier. It's nice to get phone calls that say, I'm with you, I've got your back, you're standing up for the right thing. And not only call when you have a, I disagree with you, why are you doing that phone call? Both are certainly welcome and both are important. But to really get around the state and say to people, often on most issues, legislators get 0 or 2 communications on most issues. We get more than that. Well, on big issues, we get more, right? And as a legislator from Burlington, because I was talking about GMOs or cannabis reform or minimum wage, I used to get phone calls from people all over the state, sometimes because they didn't know who their own rep was, or they just paid attention to who was on the TV or who was on the radio. So if you happen to be on and you're talking about something, then you get calls from people all over the state. But staying engaged, developing those relationships, and what I would say is probably many of you already have relationships with these fine folk, but if you have other friends in other parts of the state, encouraging them. I remember during the discussion about the Affordable Care Act in Washington, which apparently the discussion is going to rear its ugly head again in the next week. People said, well, what do we do? Our delegation is great. I said, well, who do you know in Pennsylvania? Who do you know in Ohio? Who do you know in a couple of those swing spots, Maine, Alaska? You know, we are people that have connections all over the country. And so those of us who are in states where we've got representation that is good, maybe our job is to call a friend in another state and say, call your rep, call your senator, and use the phone tree that you have. The other side has used social media quite well with trolls and bots and all kinds of things to spread misinformation and to have things that are really not relevant become front burner issues. We have to counter that. So one of the things I've been saying is, if you find time to have dinner with friends a couple nights a week for a couple hours, if you have time to jog or exercise a few hours a week, if you have time to spend a few hours a week in your garden, do you have 15 minutes to 30 minutes a week for democracy? Is it really so much to ask? Thank you. And it might just, sort of grow on you, and maybe it'll be something you do 2 or 3 hours a week or 4 hours a week, but literally 15 minutes a week. Because if you think about it, you go, well, what good is that going to do? 15 minutes is so little. Well, if you scan stories like on Digger and you read some of the comments and you just spend 10 minutes, once a week, 15 minutes, liking or unliking certain comments, that can change the meme of what's being read by news reporters, by political folks who read them. And you see that something that maybe was 50-50 all of a sudden becomes 70-30. And you start, and that changes the zeitgeist, that changes the discussion, that changes the flow of the kinds of questions media might ask. That changes how someone who's ardent in a position might soften on that position, realizing that maybe it's not as strongly supported. And that discussion ebbs and flows based on what the sentiment that everybody senses is happening around the state. So a little bit of time, writing a letter to the editor once in a while, like I said, going online once in a while, asking for a local meeting with your legislator and maybe organizing one and doing the effort so that the legislator, who is working very hard and often not well compensated for that, can come to an event and speak, but not also have to organize the event on top of spending 10, 12, 14 hours a day during the session just doing the job you've asked them and given them to do. So there's a lot of different ways that work for different people. But one of the things, again, 15 minutes, what's that going to do? Well, I don't know how many people here participated either in Washington, D.C. or Montpelier or locally, or maybe went to Manchester on January 21st. Did anybody else participate in the Women's March? Okay, right? Good job. Well, and others didn't, and that's okay. People had family issues and other obligations and so forth, or just didn't want to go out yet because you were just crying in your tea in the morning. But 4 million people, right? That's how many came out. Well, 4 million people doing 15 minutes of activity a week is 1 million hours of work for discourse and democracy a week. So if you don't think 15 minutes is very much, that's what the math bears out. And again, if you think that there's double and triple and quadruple or 60 million people that voted for someone else that all did 15 minutes a week, then you're talking about 15 million hours a week of participation, deliberation, and discussion. And so really what I've been doing all over the state, along with talking about specific issues, and I'm happy to do Q&A about any issues you want to talk about, is saying, isn't the signal now that it's time for us to engage in the way that Mike indicated that some others have very under the radar been getting engaged and doing things to change this discussion in the wrong direction, and to elect people that now not only is it 2/3 of the legislative bodies, but it's 2/3 of the lieutenant governors. It's 2/3 of the governors. It's really bottom to top. And what we need to do, and I think Bernie's been talking about this, and Hillary started an organization, is doing more about this as well. When you're running a business, you have a clientele you're trying to reach. If you're selling a high-end car, it might be one group of people. If you're selling an energy-efficient car, it might be another set of people. You have a targeted audience when you run a business. And you also get to make all the decisions if you have a small business or you're the CEO of a big business or whatever it is. Government doesn't choose the constituency. Government doesn't choose a certain clientele to be taken care of or reaching out for or whatnot. Our government and our democracy is for every single person, regardless of demographic, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of economic circumstances, regardless of physical or mental ability, regardless of age, regardless even of whether they can vote or not, right? Everybody, because anybody under 18, what do we not represent them? Of course we do. Government is for all of the people. And that's a very, very big difference. The second very big difference is it isn't all decisions made by one CEO or one top-down person. It is a deliberative process. And it's a process of give and take. And it's a process of trying to figure out how to improve the lives of people whose lives may need some support without depriving others. You know, it's not raising one up by squishing someone else down. The goal is to build everybody up and bring everybody to a better place. If we're truly patriotic, we are thinking about all of our fellow citizens. If we're nationalistic, that's a different way of thinking. But as patriotic individuals, it's about thinking about our neighbor and the neighbor we don't know and the neighbor outside of our view and the neighbor that we don't hang out with and who has different views. So government is not a business. Now, do we want to be efficient? Yes. Do we want to use tax dollars wisely? Yes. Do we want to be, smart with your money and not be penny wise, pound foolish? Yes. And unfortunately, in the world of soundbite politics, with quick snap things that sound really great at first, that's often penny wise, pound foolish. Great, we can save this money here now. But what is the long-term consequence of not investing in infrastructure? What is the long-term consequence of underfunding our public education system so that folks that might not have as educationally supportive a circumstance or might just have different learning skills don't get the support they need, and then they end up not really being able to be a part of the economic process? Is that really beneficial in the long run? Or does that harm us all in the long run with further costs down the line to make up for that difference? Investment is a good thing. So if we're penny wise, pound foolish and just say, just cut all the time without actually being specific about it, then it's great soundbite politics, but it's really foolish both economic and democratic process. And with your involvement, so when you hear the soundbite politics, if you write the letter to the editor that pushes back, if you pick up the phone and call a few people in a district nearby that maybe needs a little bit more of a nudge on their legislator, those are the ways that those of us who are serving you are going to reach our colleagues besides our conversations. Them hearing it from the bottom up is how the change that we want to see is going to happen. So I just speak to that from my own experience. GMOs didn't happen because I jumped up and down and yelled really loud. GMOs are something we ought to be talking about. GMOs are something we ought to be talking about. I did happen to do that. But as Lt Guthrie says, if one person does it, they'll think you're an idiot. They're going to throw you out in the street. They'll think you're crazy. And some people did back in 1999 when I was introducing GMO legislation. But as they heard more and more of their constituents talking about what is in their food, that's what made my colleagues start to think more about it, those that hadn't been. Cannabis reform, been working on it for 20 years. It isn't because I've been working on it for 20 years that the discussion has changed. It's not like, Colorado voted it because I was talking about it in Vermont. It's because people voted it and brought it up and discussed it. And people are all over the country. And Jeanette's been doing a lot of work, obviously, in this part of the state. So all of these issues, economic justice, Bernie has been a champion of economic justice from when he was getting 2% and 4% of the vote back in the early 70s, right? But more and more people are talking about it. And as the people talk about it, that's what makes the political process change. So if you're not doing 15 minutes a week to make that change in the right direction, then someone else who's going in a different direction is doing that. And they've been out 15-minuting us for a while now. And I would say it's time for us to do that 15 or maybe 30 minutes to make up for some time in the past and push it back. So I'm really excited to have all of you out tonight, getting involved in the Democratic Party with the meeting tonight. I guess this is both a Dummerston and a Putney group maybe all together a little bit, and others maybe who are visiting, and engaging in the political process. Because, there are, I might get in trouble from some of my colleagues in the back, the vast majority of the Democrats are right with us on a lot of these issues. But there are times, I think Mike and Jeanette would delicately agree with me, that not everybody is ready to row in the same direction within the party. There's a lot of discussion in different directions. And sometimes we need to help maybe get some of those oars back in line with the oars that Mike and Jeanette are pulling on. And I use that reference. I used to be a coxswain in a scull boat in high school. So, if your oars aren't pulling at the same time, you're not going to get very far very fast. And so more people engaging within the party and pushing the party to be better on universal health care, on raising the minimum wage. I know there's some efforts in the House passed paid family leave, and we'd like to do it maybe with a little more of a mixture of funding in the Senate, but hopefully we'll be moving that. But I know, and I suspect you supported that at the time, of a more balanced approach, but they got what they could through the House. But we need to get more of us in line, moving the party and the elected officials within the Democratic Party, putting more pressure on the Republicans, pushing more with the progressives, all together in the direction of economic justice. Because to me, the bottom line is, if you don't have economic justice, and this is probably the biggest lesson I've learned from Bernie. I came into politics as an environmentalist. I was all about climate change and other things in the early 90s, UVM, organizing Earth Day, and so forth and so on. And what I learned from Bernie is, there's a lot of folks that care about the environment, but if you can't afford to put food on the table, you can't afford to feed your family, you can't afford to heat your home, you can't afford to put gas or fuel in your car, then you're probably not buying recycled toilet paper. You're probably not putting solar panels on your roof. You're probably not doing some of those things that are sound investments if you have the capital and the cash to do it. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, the bottom line is economics. So until we do the work to make economic justice, I fear that the environmental justice we're seeking, the social justices we're seeking, the gender equity justice we're seeking, the racial justice that we're seeking, and many, many more, those are not going to become reality until we get economic justice. And the concentration of wealth also over those same 40 years has really moved in the wrong direction. So I will now open it to Q&A because I've probably been talking too long. I don't know how long I'm supposed to have. But so
I just wanted to raise another point, and why we're here, and why we asked David to come here. And this is something that's happened across Vermont, and it's happened here, and it's something that I want to continue to talk about and work together, because it's about working together. Progressive Democrat, Democratic progressive. There's not much difference here.
Reese's peanut butter cup.
It's time we worked together for a common cause. And what I'd like to do is continue to build these bridges so we don't waste our time fighting amongst ourselves, but keep our eye on the prize, which is we need a different governor. Yeah. We need a different governor.
That's a good point. Yes, we do.
We need
a
veto-proof House. Jeanette, you had something to say?
No, I was going to ask a question.
Okay, well, I just wanted to make that point. And Democrats, progressives, Democrats, there's a fine line between us. We can keep those distinctions, but realize that we have more in common than not, so let's work together and move common cause forward. So Jeanette, you have a question?
Yeah, so my question is, I'm sitting in the back of the room and I can see everybody's head. And I can count on one hand people people who are your age or younger.
Yeah.
How do we, what do we do to get them motivated?
Well, instead of inviting me out, you get Bernie to come here.
We've got Avery here.
How old is he?
Right?
We've got the
Avery.
biggest Bernie fan in Vermont here.
Avery. Well, to answer the question, sorry.
I just say, I know a lot of younger people who are working, but they're working, they've got kids in school, they're working at
Yeah.
the school, so they're doing a lot down at that level.
Right.
Yeah, no, I didn't
So-
mean to get them here necessarily.
But involved in politics. So the question for these folks was how to get more young people involved. And I will say a couple things. One is the silver lining to the very dark cloud that is cast across this country with the person who resides in the Oval Office is that he is really motivating a lot of people to get involved. It's sort of like a boomerang effect. I would also say Bernie's campaign got a lot of people involved. And since this is a discussion a little bit about the Democratic Party, I would say get involved, because within the Democratic Party, there is a significant discussion nationally and even at the state level with respect to me and what's my role and so forth. And I won't get into all the details now. But as to, what is and isn't a Democrat and who's this and who's that, we could debate and discuss all that. I'm not really sure that excites very many young people to get involved in politics, to be perfectly honest. If you focus on the issues and push on the issues, I think Fossil, who is the chair of the Democratic Party, has been hosting healthcare forums around the state around universal primary care. I've encouraged him to do that. And I've said, with the staff that the party has, there could be issue discussions almost sort of quarterly throughout the state. Every corner of the state could have a quarterly issue discussion and get back to the issues that matter to people. The back and forth about who belongs in the party, who doesn't belong in the party, how the party apparatus works, the caucus system, the primary system, that stuff drives people away faster than oil and water. And if you talk about the issues, and I would argue what made it so I was able to win both the primary and the general election is that I have just focused on issues, for years and years and years. And sometimes I've stuck my neck out and it's been out a little far and I've gotten beaten up a little bit for this or that at the time. But it certainly inspires people more to hear people talk about issues. You look at the young people attracted to Bernie's campaign and Bernie's efforts, talking about economic justice, talking about climate change in particular, I think for young people, college tuition, absolutely. What brings you out? Yeah.
So
This is
Okay.
for public television though, so they can hear you.
okay.
Because others care too.
Okay. So I agree with everything that you're saying. Another thing that I think is vital is building trust from the beginning with young people that they matter and they will be listened to. I think that there's this popular sentiment among a lot of older people, whatever you want to call older in this case, that they really want to see young people involved. They really want to see young people getting out there. But when that actually happens, young people are very often discredited simply because of our age. So stick to what you say. Stick to the things that that you're asking for from young people. And when young people do raise their voices and try to get involved, support them.
And I would say, again, this is a conundrum within the party, particularly at the national level, but the party platform has really become much, much more small p progressive, both nationally and at the state level over the last number of years. But now the platform has to get executed. So it's also a matter of saying it's not just words on paper. It's also supporting the policymakers who are of the same vein as what the platform is, and again, pushing those that aren't quite there yet to be that, and engage both the party and the elected officials to say, if you are running with a Democratic label after your name, do you believe in this whole list of values that the party stands for? And, you know, again, I may step on a couple toes here, but if there's a Democrat who is really not holding up to that end of the values, the discussion of a primary, everyone says never primary an incumbent. You know, ultimately, if I'm primary, that's discourse, that's debate. I think I would win, so I welcome it. No, but no, it's important. Those discussions are incredibly valuable. The key is keeping them positive, showing. I would say another thing about young people is don't go into the gutter. Gutter politics is driving people away. It's what the other side does on purpose. Because if it turns people off to politics, then they win because they are the minority, right? They're the minority in this country. Just look at the vote total, right? But they got people to stay home. They got people to say, well, do I really trust her? Wow, do I really this? Do I really that? Was Hillary my first choice? Certainly not. But way, way better choice. You know, we wouldn't have words like, we will destroy you in front of the UN today, coming out of our president's mouth, I believe, if Hillary were president. I think you would all agree with me there. So the staying positive and staying about issues and talking about what's possible are all critically important, I think, to also engaging young people. Please.
I don't know your name, but I really appreciate what you said, and particularly about sticking to what you say you believe in, and not discredit young people. On that subject, everybody says we want to get money out of politics. And yet, you know, and everybody hates Citizens United. But when you raise issues like, well, will you stop taking money from PACs or super PACs or, you know, the billionaires or dark money, even in our Democratic Party. I mean, I raised this question in Wilmington with our chair, the chair of our Democratic Party. Will you take a pledge in the Democratic Party? You won't take this kind of money. And kind of the answer that comes back is, I'd like to say yes, but actually no, because the other side is pouring so much money and we're stuck in this money chase game. And I'm curious, David, what you think about that, because it's like you never get out of that hole if you say, we want money out of politics, but yeah, we need to get money into politics so that we can, you know, beat the
Right.
Republicans.
Well, first of all, I don't take any corporate donations, so I'll just be straightforward about that. There are PACs that support me, union PACs, environmental PACs. So I don't know that PACs in and of themselves are necessarily a bad thing. They are individuals choosing to aggregate their resources and electing some folks to make a decision on where to put those resources. I think that's quite a bit different than corporate money. And we can get into a long discussion about why if you want, but I don't think I have to convince anybody what the difference is, but maybe you may feel that all PACs are bad. But again, you know, if people are engaged 15 minutes a week, they're gonna start to know a little bit more. I faced some pretty negative attacks during my campaign near the end, and part of that was an effort to close the polling to then entice national money to come in and beat the you know what out of me. Luckily, it didn't close it enough to do that. But I think one of the reasons it didn't close it as much as negative attacks typically do is because I had been consistent and worked on some of these issues for so long that at least a fair number of people felt that they knew me well enough. Now, that's because I'd been out there in the news a lot. But for a lot of folks who might run, they might not have been in the news as much. And so those negative attacks really work well. On the other hand, if we get the general public engaged just a little bit on a more regular basis, then people will become more familiar with all the different players, all the different participants in democracy. And the negative ads will start to have less of an effect because people say, you know, I've read about Jane Doe 30 times. I've never heard anybody saying that stuff about her. Or John Smith. And maybe that's an idealistic vision. But with respect to the party and taking money, I am not, well, I now have a delegate to the executive committee because technically I'm the highest elected Democrat in the state, having won the primary and run with both labels. And certainly with my delegate, if there were a vote although the executive committee does not actually make the policy of the state, it's the state committee. And so what I would encourage people to do is get involved in the party at the town level, then get elected to the county level. And from the county level, you can get elected to the state committee and work with the colleagues at the state committee level to make that policy decision. And if enough people have this value, that will change the party. But it will also mean those people and everybody else who's elected them will have to pick up a little bit more effort, because it's going to take more letters to the editor to counter the negative ads and say, I saw this ad, and for that reason, I'm not voting for the other person because they're standing behind by not disavowing those ads. And at some point, the pushback has to be stronger than the effect of the ads. And that's, again, from the bottom up. Sorry, this one, and then back there.
I'm curious because Vermont is in many ways a very blue state, and yet we do have a Republican governor.
Right.
And I'm curious, and I tend to think of myself more as an independent, actually. My guess is that many people in Vermont politics got worried about the deficit under the previous administration.
Okay.
And so I'm curious if the Democratic Party is going to be relevant for a future of Vermont where people are trying to make a living. Because I'm with you completely with issues and economic justice, and it does appear that the Republicans were able to make a stronger case for economic development, and the Democrats, to be perfectly honest, looked a little as if they couldn't manage the budget. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how that's going to turn around, because I think it is not just issues, it's also people are looking at economic reality, and it looks a little scary in Vermont, particularly for young people.
So a couple different things, and the first is just a factual little correction, if you don't mind, and I'm not trying to be rude. The state of Vermont does not run deficits, okay? So we have never had, maybe in the early 90s we were close to having it, and then we passed a temporary tax under Dean for about 3 years or 4 years. That went away once we were in that dip. But we do not have deficit spending for annual expenditures the way that both the federal government and many states do. So we always pass. Well, right. So the shortfall issues are that, you can do all the best projections you want in terms of what your expenses are going to be and what your revenues are going to be. But in the complexity of a whole state, sometimes those are more accurate and sometimes they're less. Even $28 million out of a multi-billion-dollar budget is a very, very small percentage being off. And some years it's one direction and some years it's the other. It just so happens, what's interesting, and this is sort of the delay effect. I mean, isn't Trump amazing because our economy is doing so much better now, right? Because that's all because of Trump, right? Not really true, right? All the jobs that have been created in the last 7 months are not because all of a sudden Trump is president. It's because we've been on this trajectory of increasing jobs for the longest period of history in the country, I believe, with policies that President Obama has been putting into place. We are actually, up until recently, we were making headway because we'd been reducing our Medicaid rolls because of policies that Mike and Jeanette, myself, and others put into place, working on that prevention money early on, putting money into schools, putting money into children, putting money into economic development, putting money into support services and wraparound services for families to try to bring them out of poverty. And so actually for a number of years, we actually, and even this year, the governor is able to pass a budget without raising any taxes because our Medicaid rolls have actually been declining in cost for a number of years in a row. Now, it then turned out that revenues were short. So even though our expenses in some regards have been going down in areas that are big budget items, the revenue did come in short. But that's not a matter of not managing your money well. In fact, I would argue your money was managed very well in investing in preventative programs that actually have been now paying the dividends that Governor Scott gets to take advantage of. I would say that's relatively accurate, nodding heads from my colleagues. So, management of your household finances, is not a one-year process. For many, it's a week-to-week process, frankly. For about half of the state, it's a week-to-week process. Happens to be a lower percentage in Vermont than some other states. But also, something that's talked about, again, in terms of broadening our knowledge base. Rural states, or I should say rural areas, all over the country are hemorrhaging jobs, are hemorrhaging young people, are having the same effect that Vermont's having. It does not matter whether it is red or whether it is blue. But what happens is we look at our little part of the world, and then with sound bites, it's all these liberal socialist policies are driving people out of the state. Well, actually, no, Vermont is the same microcosm as everywhere else. Chittenden County is, quote, metropolitan. Obviously, I put that in quotes for a reason. But people are moving to Chittenden County and southern Franklin County and parts of Addison and Washington County. But elsewhere, it's a challenge, except for little pockets. Same is true in rural places all over the country. So what we have to do is figure out how to do economic development in our rural areas and so forth. I happen to think we have a distinct advantage over the Nebraskas and the Iowas of the world because we actually have a quarter of the U.S. population with some of the largest disposable income in the world, all within a one-day drive. So, you here in the southern part of the state have some of the best opportunity to take advantage of that. And we're seeing lots of small businesses developing really high quality products and selling them into those marketplaces. And people are able to do small businesses and get into that. That does take seed money. That takes economic development and investment. And those are the kinds of things that government can be involved with to help someone just get on their feet under them. I would argue universal health care is probably the biggest economic development tool there is. Because then people who currently might be working for someone else and afraid to go out with their entrepreneurial idea and start something new because they're going to lose their health insurance and their health care coverage, can use that creative idea and start a business and create all those 3 and 10 and 15 person businesses, which are the lifeblood of Vermont. We are not going to draw a 500 person business to Vermont. Now, I would happen to argue, and I have, and Jeanette and I are pretty well hand in hand on this one, and I'm quite certain Mike supports this too. Frankly, our biggest economic development bill, probably for the next and past 10 to 20 years, is actually cannabis reform. We would have 2 to 3 grow facilities potentially in every town, or at least one in every town. They're going to have $40,000 to $60,000 a year jobs with people living in their communities, even if the retail locations are less frequent, so it doesn't freak people out. And you add that money into each rural town, you have more people for your fire squad. You might also have, then at the state level, resources to put into both higher ed trust fund and or an economic development fund after we pay for prevention and treatment facilities for those for whom any substance is a problem, whether it's our opiate problem, which is obviously quite severe, but alcohol, which is far more severe than cannabis, and many other drugs, law enforcement for the roads, and running the program. All of those things. If we then took the resources and invested them and made our state colleges more affordable for young people, and if we then also put an endowment together for economic development and cleaned up the brownfields in Springfield and Bennington, or we invested in weatherization for a few years and helped create those jobs, we would have an economic engine for many, many years. And we would frankly draw tourists as well. So we do need to be, we do it for beer. I mean, it's really interesting. Whenever anybody who's in the State House goes, "That's terrible stuff, I can't believe you're doing that," I say, "Well, what do you think of our microbrew industry?" "That's amazing." Really? Interesting.
So my question was exactly close to that, which is, thinking about the money, what can we do to make this cannabis issue not be screwed up again next year? It just seems like every year in the legislature, something completely screws up and it doesn't pass, and it's crazy. It's already legal in Massachusetts, it's going to be legal in Canada, it's going to be legal in Maine. Are we going to be behind Rhode Island someday? It's crazy.
We'll probably be behind Nebraska.
Yeah,
in part, I look towards Mike a little bit, and I look towards the governor. And it's repeated all very frequently in the media. Well, the Senate's passed this 5 times, there is the world of the boogeyman. It's the unknown, it's people are afraid of what they don't know. And frankly, a number of legislators, I don't know where they grew up. I don't know what they did and didn't do when they were younger. But a lot of them just, succumb to the reefer madness, mentality and their local law enforcement. Jeanette, yeah.
I think that one of the problems is that legislators their knees go weak when we talk about it, and I think that they don't listen. I don't know if you know who Dick Sears is or not, but he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee. And 2 years ago, I met with him, and with Shumlin, and we wanted to do cannabis reform, and he said, no way, I will never support this ever, 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 but out of respect for the two of you, meaning me, who's on judiciary, and Shumlin, who is the governor, he said, I'll take committee hearings. And he became one of the biggest proponents and supporters of the legalization and regulation, because and I asked him about that, and he said, because I listened. I paid attention and I listened to what people were saying. And I think that is the problem, is that legislators get themselves into this corner where they're shaking and they can't listen.
Well, and I would just add to that. We all fall into that trap. I don't think it's just legislators. We all have the values we hold or the beliefs we hold. And it's difficult sometimes to say, you know what? Maybe I was wrong. I mean, I don't know who is in a long-term relationship with somebody, but once in a while it's like, oh, actually maybe I was wrong. It's not always an easy thing to do, and it's true with legislators. We're human just like anybody else. But last I checked, drug dealers don't check ID.
So can I go back to my question?
Yes.
Is there something that people that live in a district where our legislators do support legalization can do in this upcoming session? I mean, do you all have ideas, or will you have ideas?
You can write letters to the editor, to Vermont Digger, and to large media outlets. You can, go ahead, Jeanette.
You do what David said at the beginning. You call your friends that live in different districts.
There are, in the House, I believe there were 42 or 52 Democrats, primarily, maybe a Republican or two, that voted for a full system legislation. And that was up from 17 or 22 the year before. So it is moving in the right direction. The governor, actually, I think, really didn't read the state of Vermont sentiment well when he vetoed the bill. And make no mistake about it, the commissions he's put together, look like, oh, I'm open and it's a good thing, but they've got a 2 to 3 year timeline on any real action. I suspect we will probably work to take action again this coming year, and the House, frankly, is where we need to garner that support. So this is where I say, make no assumptions about a legislator, and I'll use a parallel piece so that I don't step on anyone's toes. But many years ago, I was supporting end-of-life choices, and we were not going to have the votes in the House to pass it. And I said to the Speaker, please have the vote anyway, because there's a number of people that are voting no, who their constituents would assume that they would be voting yes. And until they're on the record voting a way that their constituents also go, oh, really? Bob said no, I thought they'd be a yes. Then they'll pick up the phone. And that's why I said, sometimes call your legislator that you support and you think they're going to do the right thing just to check in. Because it isn't always the case. And on cannabis, there's a number of people that you think, oh, they would support that. And they're not voting for it yet. Now they have voted no a couple times. I think a number of them heard, and the number went up, and that would happen again. But calling your friends in other parts of the state is a big one. Yes?
A couple more questions.
Okay, yeah. And I'll try to be shorter in my answers. I'm sorry.
I'm hoping that back to the cannabis issue, that while we do have a licensed, organized, revenue-generating system of cannabis, that we also allow people, just like we do beer in our
absolutely.
You need to be able to grow some plants
Yep.
in our fields.
Well, I know Jeanette and I both support that. And that was in the recent legislation.
That was in my 94-page amendment to a 2-page bill. That passed the Senate in about 10 minutes.
Yes.
So I was paying a lot of attention to the passage of H308, which was the racial justice legislation that really was very advanced in the state of Vermont for how we look at racial disparities in our state. And one of the things that's come up for me is in that process, it's opened up the Vermont criminal justice training council's rewriting of our fair and impartial policing policies, which were really, since 2016 when they passed, pretty state-of-the-art and pretty sophisticated nationally. And what I'm starting to notice and worry about is recently the Burlington and Montpelier fair and impartial policing laws started to take a step backwards. And so here we have, by January 1st, a vote that's going to take place in the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council that will change our fair and impartial policing laws. And so for many of us who were excited about this racial justice legislation, we said, oh, this is our opportunity to move forward.
They're seeing it moving back.
And there's, I think because of some of the national sentiment, there is a emboldened behavior that's starting to happen within law enforcement communities that looks like we could have losses instead of gains. And so I just wanted to raise that as an issue and also just ask if you and your colleagues would pay attention to that process, because the vote that will finalize that will be in December through the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council. We are seeing the Attorney General is paying attention to that process. Many of us locally who are doing racial justice activism are paying attention to it. But I just wanted to raise it as an issue and wondered if you also had additional thoughts about some of the racial justice legislation or some of the outcomes that are potential there because of that legislation.
Well, thank you. I was not at the present as aware of some of those things, so I really appreciate you bringing that to my attention. And Martha's been judiciously waving my clipboard over there, which is that, and it'll be related to this answer, which is I do put out a newsletter specifically during the session every 2 to 4 weeks. Outside the session is a little less frequent. And sometimes I raise issues to help people with that 15 minutes and say, here's 3 issues coming up. Feel free to learn more about them or contact your legislator. Here's the website. And the reason I bring that up is it also, then you get the email, you can also send me emails and update me on things like this so that I can be better informed. And certainly, I'm sure Jeanette, who serves on the Judiciary Committee, where that bill moved through, is either aware or now more aware of some of this as well. But yeah, there's no doubt. Keep me informed, and I will try to keep a closer lens, and I'll ask TJ about what's going on with respect to some of the municipal activities. But I thought the idea was to bring up the local municipalities that weren't quite there as opposed to pare back the forward-thinking legislation. So if the opposite's happening, that's a problem.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about that, because there's some...
Laura, did you have a
It's a little more
question?
complicated than that.
No, I think she was waving it, it might have looked like.
Oh, okay. So one more question, and then just to remind people, what time did you get up this morning?
I couldn't quite sleep. Normally I get up between 4:30 and 5. I got up at 3:30, but I did get a ride down, so I took a nice nap on the way here, and I'll nap on the way home. But it is harvest season. We're bringing between 2,000 and 5,000 pounds of food a day in to stock up the coolers for the winter. So it's exciting. Some of the biggest Napa cabbage I've ever grown. But I had rotten carrots in July, so from all that rain. So we're trying to make up for some of the lost ground. Same with broccoli, went south on us. But the other farmers or gardeners probably are becoming familiar with Swede midge as well, which is starting to be a real problem.
South don't like that term.
Which?
Went south on us.
Well, fair enough. This is not south. My mom lives in Virginia, and that's not even south to some. But I understand. I understand. Sure.
I'm already thinking about 2020 with great concern, and thinking about, it was when we were doing outreach in New Hampshire, a lot of our friends were so dubious that Trump would win. But when you get out and you do door to door, you find out what you were talking before, economic issue with the base. And we suck as Democrats, and progressives, but really Democrats, as meeting people where they are and helping to shift them. And the psychology of change is like, how are we part of the same tribe? How can we build up that we're part of the same tribe and shift on values? And so I love what you're saying about moving people and making sure that we're representing the basic needs to be able to move people on these different issues. So I'm wondering, for the Democratic Party, I'm thinking nationally, but also in our state, talking about shifting what you mentioned, the House majority and Senate majority and governor. I really am so curious about how we can do that. And I went and heard Fossil speak, and he was talking about using, what's the guy, don't think of an elephant, looking at more about psychology, because we are not doing a good job of communicating and making people feel included in our party. So do you have ideas on how we could How can we do that?
Well, I guess a couple things. One is, and I was on public radio last week or the week before. I don't know if anybody heard me on Noon Edition with Jane. And folks asked sort of how do you do practical and progressive politics at the same time? And sometimes you have to go to where people are and work to understand them and give them your ear before you try to yank them along. You know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? And it's really important, I think, to connect with people on that level, that emotional level. You know, all the facts in the world aren't necessarily going to matter, apparently, right? I mean, we're in this alternative fact world, Kellyanne. And just taking a moment and having someone feel like they're being heard. You know, the folks that came out for Trump are not all misogynists. They're not all racist. They're not all terrible people. There is a segment of them that certainly may well be. But many, many, many of them are people that feel the system has not been reaching out to them. The system has not been listening to them, and the system has not been helping them. And they're right. And I would argue, interestingly enough, many people in this room completely agree. It has been a system driving money to the corporate elite and the folks with capital who can invest in Wall Street and not helping people on Main Street. But we did a terrible job of talking about that in the way that they could hear. That's not their fault, right? We have to look in the mirror and say, okay, how is it that the story we're trying to tell is not being received? And we have to have the same message, but maybe change how we message it. And part of that is listening. And part of it is saying, you know, you're not deplorable. You know, you're not a bad person because you didn't make it economically when the system is so stacked against you. You know, you're not a failure if you don't come in first place. I mean, our whole society, I've been thinking, I'm not a big fan, by the way, of everybody gets a ribbon for participation. I think that's terrible. But maybe you disagree with me, but I just think that, you know, people do have to be motivated a little bit. But at the same time, everything is about who is first. So-and-so is the first person to get this many Emmys. So-and-so is the first place person in this. It's all about first. And very few people out of 300 million people are going to be first. And yet a lot of us can be very successful without being first. And so we have to redefine success and really acknowledge people's achievements and not basically say, unless you're first, you're last. And you're a loser. And you're terrible. Because their own psychology, anyone's psychology, you start to think that way about yourself, you're going to lash out that it's someone else's fault eventually. And that's the other. That's the immigrant. That's the Muslim. That's the uppity woman. I mean, it's stupid stuff. But it's their fault, not, you know, and that's a human defensive mechanism. And we have to create a discussion that says we are all in this together. The system doesn't necessarily benefit everyone. And our community value is that we're going to try to make it so that everybody has an opportunity for education, for economic stability, et cetera, which goes back to universal health care, goes to minimum wage, goes to family leave, et cetera. But it is, empathy is pretty important. And it's a pretty male-dominated society in the political realm. So the whole world of like empathy and, you know, I feel your pain and, you know, so forth is not always as genetically ingrained in some of us. We want to just solve the problem, right? Anybody with me on this one? But sometimes it's important to listen and then bring people along. And what I said on the radio the other day was go to where someone is, work with them, think about them, listen to them, and take hands and start walking forward together. Don't yank on them to come to where we want to be. So I thank you for the opportunity, and we'll stick around for a little bit. And please sign up for the newsletter if you want. And Michael, Jeanette, thank you.
Just to add to that, you know, your point's well taken about messaging. But underneath that, and that's why we're here tonight, what we need to do is organize. And that's where we don't want to get caught short. Last December, I went to a conference for progressive legislators from all over the country in D.C. And I had breakfast one morning with some people from Alabama and Detroit, all African-American legislators. And the man from Detroit said, I worked for both Obama campaigns. I knew what a good ground game was. I worked on it. We kept waiting for that to happen, and it never did. We can't let that happen again. We can't let it happen in Vermont. We can't let it happen in New Hampshire, New England, anywhere. That's why we're starting today. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for coming along.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank Martha for driving me.
So, what I'm going to suggest, we're ready for the second part of our evening tonight. For those who are here to work with Putney Democrats, we're going to gather in the back here. I don't know if you need to get on the road right away. If people want to
Yeah, I can hang for a little bit.
talk with David, I'll ask you to take
Go
this
that
part
way.
here.
Sure.
Hopefully we can do our business in short order. But what we're doing now is the legally mandated requirement that we have to reorganize for the next election. That means we elect our officers, start to line up who's going to be part of our party, working ahead, connecting that to the county and then the state level.
Can I ask, if you're not going to stay, would you please look at the bottom of your chair and see if it says return to the Putney Friends Meeting House? And fold it up and put it right beside my car. My car is the one that says Senate 16, but don't put it behind the car because then I can't open it up and put them back in. Thank you.
And I have business cards as well.
Sarah?
We should have brought you